Hello, and thank you all for joining us on this webinar today. My name is Allison May, and I'm with the Early Care and Education Project at the National Conference of State Legislatures. And I'm happy to welcome everyone to the webinar call today, Integrating Early Childhood Data. I'm also joined on the line by my colleague Julie Poppy, a member of the Early Care and Education Project at NCSL. Julie and I are excited with today's turnout, and we know this will be an interesting and informative webinar. From looking at our registration numbers, it appears that we have approximately 32 states, DC, and Puerto Rico on the webinar. And before we go too deep into content, I'd like to familiarize you with the webinar platform. So my first request is if you can all find the chat box, which you'll see at the lower left-hand corner of your screen. You can post questions in this chat box at any time during the webinar, but in order to build up some comfortability with the chat feature and also get a better sense of who's on the webinar today, I'd ask that you all take a moment and type the state that you're participating from. We've got a lot of, variety in the group. This is terrific, guys. Great. Well, so for those that are still typing, please feel free, but as I mentioned, this chat feature, you can at any point type in questions that you'd like to pose to our presenters, and we'll certainly we'll take some time to answer them. So as many of you already know, data from both the early childhood and K-12 sectors can help policymakers inform policy discussions and funding decisions, chart the progress of children, programs, and the state, strengthen the support of early childhood workforce, and pinpoint best practices and areas of need. So over the next 60 minutes, we'll take a deeper dive and discuss linking limited but critical early childhood and K-12 data, which can help states know whether policies and programs successfully transition children from early childhood to the classroom and get them ready for school. So over the next hour, you'll hear from the Early Childhood Data Collaborative, ECDC, and Data Quality Campaign, DQC, about how state legislators and policymakers can support the linkage and use of early childhood and K-12 data to inform policy and improve child outcomes. Today's webinar is the third in a 5-part series of webinars being hosted by NCSL's Early Care and Education Project. We are recording this webinar today. We'll have an archived copy of it available and posted to the NCSL website shortly. The archived copy will be added to the webpage where you found registration information for today's webinar, where you can also find information for the remaining webinars in the series. We'll have a URL noted on our closing slide for ease and convenience. One of our goals over the next hour is to make this presentation as interactive as possible. So again, if you have questions, feel free to type them into the chat box. Today we'll hear from 2 presenters representing DQC and ECDC. We'll aim to answer as many questions as possible during the presentation and at the conclusion. And I'll note that we're going to give priority to questions coming from legislators and legislative staff that have joined us today. If we're unable to answer all the questions at the end of our time, we will send out an email with answers to those that remain. So next, I want to just quickly familiarize you with another feature on our webinar platform. So if you look on your screen, at the top right of your screen, you'll see an icon that looks like a square piece of paper with a play button or a triangle on it. And as you mouse over the icon, you'll see the words, "Show me the media library." And so if you click on this icon, you'll be able to access a copy of the actual slide deck that we're using today, along with a helpful resource that was put together by our presenters that includes key resources related to the webinar, and a report co-authored by ECDC and DQC called Roadmap for Early Childhood and K-12 Data Linkages. So before I turn the webinar over to our presenters, I just want to share a little information with you about them. Today we have Carlise King, who's the Executive Director at ECDC. She has over 16 years of experience conducting state and national level research on early childhood issues and examining the impact of state and federal policies on parents' access to child care services, licensed child care supply, child care costs, and the child care workforce. Joined with Carlise is Elizabeth Dabney. She's the Director for Research and Policy Analysis at the Data Quality Campaign, where she leads work in support of the organization's goal to help ensure success for all students through access to and meaningful use of high-quality data. She manages DQC's efforts to understand states' progress toward key milestones in the use of data in service of student learning. And with that, I will turn the webinar over to our presenters.
Thank you so much, Allison and Julie, for having us today. Carlise and I are very happy to be joining you on this webinar. For just a little bit of background on the Data Quality Campaign, in case you're not familiar with us, we are a nonprofit policy and advocacy organization leading the effort to bring every part of the education community together to empower educators, families, and policymakers like yourselves with quality information to make decisions that ensure that students excel. Take Grace, for example, who is the student in this infographic. Data help paint a picture of how students like Grace are doing throughout their education and into their careers starting in early childhood. Data helps you better see whether or not the students in your states are prepared for what comes next.
Good afternoon. This is Carlise King from the Early Childhood Data Collaborative. I also wanted to share a little bit about the collaborative and then talk about why we feel a focus on early childhood data is important. ECDC's mission is to promote policies and practices and to support policymakers' efforts to develop and use integrated longitudinal early care and education data systems. To date, ECDC has worked with local, state, and national early childhood leaders to identify key policy questions states want answered that rely on integrated data to make that happen, outline components of an integrated system through our 10 fundamentals, and we've also assessed states' capacity to link data needed to track program utilization, quality, and educational outcomes through our national surveys. In our last two surveys, we found that most state systems are siloed and not able to connect information about young children because information is housed and managed by different state and federal agencies. This means that data that could help policymakers answer critical questions about program access, workforce development needs, or school readiness are not accessible. So when I use the term early childhood data throughout this presentation, we generally mean three types of information. The first is child-level data. Gaps in children's learning and development appear well before kindergarten and grow over time. To support children's development, it's important that policymakers, teachers, and parents have access to timely and accurate data about children's development to implement appropriate interventions and to support them along their educational path. Having program-level information can help policymakers know which programs best support children under what circumstances. These data can be used to identify characteristics of effective programs or where improvements need to be made. Using data to identify what works is good for children and wise investments for states. The third is workforce data. As state policies promote and parents demand high-quality child care, states are working to better understand both the strengths and the needs of its early care and education workforce. This requires having good data on staff qualifications and education as their efforts to build and improve early childhood care options for families. But the challenges states face are that these data about children, program, and educators are often collected in a way that makes it difficult to understand what services a child has received before entering school or to examine trends in children's development, program quality, or workforce needs over time. This graphic below shows 6 major early care and education programs that ECDC has focused on when talking about the importance of integrating early childhood data. But there may be other publicly funded programs in your states that also contribute to children's early learning that you may want to think about as you're thinking about building an integrated system. Integrating early childhood data across programs means that if a child attended a state pre-kindergarten program and then perhaps maybe switched to a Head Start program in the middle of the year because a family moved or some other change in circumstances, a program administrator would be able to connect information about that child between those two programs and get a unique count of children served across publicly funded programs during that year. Linking to K through 12 means that information about children's participation in different early learning settings and experiences can be examined in relationship to their performance in the early elementary years. Linkages with health and social services provide connections to other support services a child may receive, such as Medicaid, or to identify services used by high-need populations, such as the number of children served in both early care and education programs as well as the foster care system. By integrating these data, policy and program questions that can't be answered by a single program alone can be answered because barriers to data sharing have been removed. On the next few slides, I've outlined questions a state may want to answer by linking their early childhood and K through 12 data. For example, questions that help the state track children's progress and understand where additional interventions or support services may be needed. So for example, are children birth to 5 on track to succeed when they enter school? A state may use their data to understand if they're meeting its goals and ensuring that all children are ready once they enter school. And connecting early childhood and K through 12 data also provides information around whether policies that guide early childhood programs are aligned with policies that guide K through 12, and that these systems are talking to each other. Several states have implemented kindergarten entry assessments to better articulate cognitive, physical, and social skills for children when they enter school. These systems have also been used to conduct research to inform future practices. For example, which early childhood experiences best prepare children from different backgrounds to be successful in school and beyond? And specifically, how can these be replicated statewide? How effective are state policies and programs that support high-quality early childhood education in preparing students for school? When connecting early childhood and K-12 data, states have developed strategies for identifying critical policy questions such as these that an integrated data system could answer, and implementing policies to ensure a secure process for accessing and using these data. I'm going to hand the presentation back to Elizabeth to share some focus areas for implementation and examples of work happening in states. Elizabeth?
Thank you, Carlise. As I'm sure you all know, research shows that quality early childhood experiences provide a strong foundation for success in school. ECDC and DQC recommend that states securely link limited but critical early childhood and K-12 data to help you know whether the policies and programs help children successfully transition from early childhood to the classroom and get them ready for school. DQC and ECDC brought together a group of experts to develop recommendations on early childhood and K-12 data linkages, focusing on 7 key areas. You might be involved in conversations about kindergarten readiness or funding high-quality early childhood programs, and data can inform your decision-making to support positive outcomes for all children. As Carlise mentioned, we will be briefly describing each of these 7 areas listed here and provide an example of state work in each area. We'll also note some additional resources to support this work. This roadmap document is a one-stop shop of recommendations, resources, and state stories. There is a lot of information in this document, and we highly encourage you to take a look at it. We've also put together a resource reference guide that Allison mentioned earlier that has additional resources in it to accompany this webinar. So you will not be lacking in resources today. While data linkages are technical mechanisms that enable a state to connect information housed in different data systems, we'll be focusing on the policies and supports that enable a high-quality link. We'll start with stakeholder engagement, which is a process to systematically and meaningfully involve those directly or indirectly affected in the outset in the data linkages work. You can think about engaging stakeholders around things like the design and development of the linkage work, the implementation of this work, and how the data that results from these linkages might be used. Think about engaging with providers, teachers, early childhood and community leaders, parents, and others. Stakeholder engagement builds trust and understanding about this work, a demand for this information, sustainability of the linkages work, and use of the linkages and the data that results from the linkages. The Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA, requires states and districts to engage stakeholders in the development of their plans. So this is a great opportunity for early childhood policymakers to influence the design and review of systems in their states and communities. The resource Strategies for Engaging Early Learning Stakeholders is from the National Center for Education Statistics, and it provides tips and examples from states on engaging stakeholders. The state of Kentucky engaged stakeholders in the development of their early childhood profiles, which you see a picture of here. Kentucky worked closely with stakeholders to create reports for local use, compile data available at the county level, and use data to improve policies and programs. These reports are also available at the state level, and they can be found on Kentucky's Kentucky Center for Education and Workforce Statistics website, which is kcews.ky.gov. If you have not seen this report before, I highly recommend it. This is an excellent resource, and I think that it could be replicated in other states. Don't forget about parents as a critical stakeholder group to engage with. They can benefit from linked data to help them make decisions about how to best support their children's early years. For example, parent polls can give you important information about parents' views. DQC has been polling parents about their views on data in education, and these are just some of the results from our 2015 parent poll. The second area we're going to talk about today is data governance, which provides state agencies with a structure in which to define the roles and responsibilities surrounding data collection, reporting, and use. Data governance creates accountability for data quality and security. It builds relationships, trust, and a commitment to a common goal, which is supporting all children in their early years. Data governance also breaks down silos across programs and agencies, which Carlise mentioned a little bit earlier, that many agencies are siloed, and data governance can help bring people together. A framework for choosing state-level early childhood governance systems is a resource from the BUILD initiative. Our state example here is in North Carolina, which has two separate but coordinated data governance structures. They have a P20W Council, which is preschool through the workforce, and the North Carolina ECIDS Governance Council. ECIDS stands for Early Childhood Integrated Data System. The ECIDS Governance Council is comprised of leadership from key participating state agencies, and those include the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services, the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction, the North Carolina State Head Start Collaboration Office, and the North Carolina Partnership for Children. So you can see how this governance structure has brought together many different agencies. The North Carolina ECIDS chair is a member of the P20W Council, so that provides coordination between the early childhood community and K-12 and beyond. Carlise will be talking more about North Carolina's great work later in this webinar. The third area is privacy, security, and transparency. Methods to ensure data privacy and security must be in place, particularly when dealing with potentially sensitive information about young children. Creating clear data privacy policies that are consistent across programs and aligned with federal and state privacy laws is essential to ensuring data security and support for early childhood and K-12 data linkages. Developing privacy and security practices could be the responsibility of the Data Governance Committee that I just referenced a little bit earlier. And in developing these policies, state leaders may want to think about the privacy laws and data security practices of existing agencies, existing state laws and practices, and existing federal laws. The Privacy and Technical Assistance Center at the U.S. Department of Education has a lot of resources on this topic of privacy and security that are tailored especially for the early childhood community. One way to address privacy and security is through legislation. DQC has been tracking state legislation regarding student data privacy for a number of years. One example of state legislation regarding privacy and data linkages is from Connecticut. In 2015, Connecticut passed a robust data linkages and privacy law. It calls for developing data linkages among state agencies, and it also describes requirements for state agency agreements with contractors to ensure that confidential data are safeguarded and accessed and used only as needed. So even though in the beginning I promised that this was not about any technical work, we are actually now at the technical aspect of this work, the linking, matching, and sharing. So linking, matching, and sharing is the technical aspect, but it is essential to following children's progress over time and answering key policy and program questions, such as the ones Carlise talked about a little bit earlier. Linking refers to the connections that allow information to flow back and forth between programs and agencies. Matching refers to the process that allows the same child's data to be found in different data systems. And sharing refers to participating agencies providing individual-level information that would not otherwise be available to the other agency. Linking, matching, and sharing allows early childhood providers, state agencies, districts, educators, and policymakers like yourself to identify problems and mobilize resources. There is a lot more information on this topic in the roadmap document that I referred to earlier, including suggestions about the types of data to share between early childhood and K-12. Our example here is Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has developed a matching process using unique identifiers. A high-quality matching process uses statewide unique identifiers assigned to each child to match education records and help ensure that the records for the same individual are being accurately matched. Pennsylvania is one of the only states that is able to link child-level data across all early childhood programs and to the state K-12 data system. I am going to pause here and ask Allison and Julie if there are any questions right now.
Thank you. We just wanted to take a quick pause and see if anyone has any questions. Do feel free to type them into the chat box right now before we continue moving on. Okay. Oh. So Virginia Early from California is asking us, is Pennsylvania collecting more data about child care preschool than required under CCDBG? And if so, what data? Are you guys able to answer that question for Virginia?
Carlise, do you happen to know the answer to that question?
Pennsylvania, I don't know if they're collecting more than what CCDBG requires. If the person has specific data that they're asking about, they started their integrated data system with their child care program and had a phased approach to then include their state preschool, Head Start, and other early childhood programs. They're able to capture information about the quality of care, as well as connecting that with their K through 12, and have developed a process for sharing back information with programs from 3rd grade to early care and education programs.
Great. We got another question here from Representative Ballwig from Wisconsin, and she's curious to know a little bit more about Pennsylvania, and specifically, was there a worry about privacy issues and the unique identifier? Are you able to answer, or maybe give a sense of Pennsylvania?
I would say that for all states, there's generally a concern about data privacy issues. I think one of the ways that Pennsylvania and other states have worked to address this is developing a system of unique identifiers where individual data is not shared. It's shared on an aggregate level. And to protect individual children's identity, they use these unique identifiers. In Pennsylvania, they have what they call a master index, so that within programs they still have unique identifiers, but there's a process to identify children across programs, as Elizabeth mentioned before. In terms of governance, I think that's where a lot of states have addressed really early on exactly how the information is going to be shared or used. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later to address to address privacy concerns that people may have. Specifically, when would an individual level information be shared, and what type of information would only be shared at an aggregate level. And I would say that states have approached this in different ways. And I'll be providing some more examples a little bit later. But I'd say that privacy is always part of the conversation, and is a key area that we feel like really should be part of the process and discussions early on in governance and in stakeholder engagement, and policies about how that data is going to be used and shared early on.
Thanks, Carly. So we'll table the privacy question that we have, but I did want to just ask one last follow-up question before we move on, and that is, at what age is the unique identifier assigned, and who assigns it?
There is a detailed write-up in the roadmap document about the process that Pennsylvania uses. So I would encourage you to take a look in the roadmap document about the matching process in Pennsylvania. So it goes into some detail, and also goes into some detail about how the state ensures that all the information is correct and a process for going about doing that. So Carlise mentioned that the master index, and so that's on the Department of Human Services side of things. There's also a Pennsylvania Department of Education identifier that's called the PA Secure ID. That's on the K-12 side of things. So there's a lot more detail in the document. And just to add on to what Carlise was just talking about privacy, and I totally agree that privacy always needs to be part of this conversation. And in addition to what Carlise mentioned about stakeholder engagement and having strong data governance, being able to demonstrate the value of doing this kind of work is another way to address concerns that parents may have, to show to parents how this information is useful, not only to them as parents, but also to the programs, to the school system, and kind of make it real for them. And really demonstrating to them perhaps there's a system that they can log into to get more information and to learn about different child care programs and high-quality programs and the transition into the K-12 system. So finding a way to demonstrate how important this work is to them as parents.
Well, thank you both. I think just to reiterate to folks, in case you're looking for the roadmap document report that both Carlise and Elizabeth have been mentioning, up on the top bar of your screen again, there's going to be a piece of paper with a play button, also looks like an arrow. And if you click on that, or if you mouse over it, what you'll see are the words, "Show me the media library." And in there, you'll find a couple resources, one of which is the roadmap report that they're referring to. And I think with that, we'll just continue on with the presentation.
Okay, they're handing things back to me, which aligns, I think, with the conversation that we've been having and the questions we've been receiving so far, so that's great. So the next area that we talk about is data access and use. And I think the conversation we often have is that data is as useful as it's used. So it's important that policymakers, practitioners, and researchers and parents have access and use data to answer questions But it's also important to determine how that data will be used, who will have access to what data. So for example, a teacher may need access to information about an individual child in their program, but only aggregate data would be provided to policymakers or community leaders who want to evaluate state or community level indicators. So I think data is really talked about in terms of the value of access, why that information is going to be used, and under what circumstances, and really being transparent about that so that people don't have the expectations that people have for how data is used is very clear. And as I was saying before, determining early on how the data will be used will also guide the type of reporting and analysis that will be needed while being able to keep individual data protected. So this will ensure that policymakers will have data that they need to take action. We see guidelines for data privacy and access going really hand in hand. So protecting the privacy of data requires clear guidance, as I was saying before, about how they are used, under what circumstances they can be shared, and determining who is authorized to access what data. In our research guide, you will find information on complying with privacy laws while ensuring the maximum use of data. So in North Carolina, their early childhood integrated data system includes an online portal which was developed with input from their stakeholders, going back to Elizabeth's comments earlier about the importance of stakeholder engagement up front. And this online portal provides access to the integrated data through standard reports, through a customized report builder, as well as a data request process for researchers. So for the standard reports, that includes data on how many children are enrolled in one or more programs that are documented through their ECIDS, or Early Childhood Integrated Data System. The custom report option allows users to develop reports at the county level. And North Carolina, similar to other systems in building it, they have specific rules that suppress any type of data once it gets to a certain level where there's concern that an individual child could be or person could be identified. So there are suppression rules, and this is something, again, that's worked through in your data governance and privacy laws, and that is transparent to those that are using the information, that data only at a certain level will be shared and at a certain level will be suppressed. And then for more detailed data requests, a researcher can request data from the integrated system, and they have developed an 8-step request process, which includes an application, clear information about how the data is going to be used and protected, and then also a process for participating agencies to approve that request. So in this case, they've thought in their initial planning around their data system about 3 different pathways for states to be able to utilize that, and determining what level of information would be used or accessed under what conditions for each type of use of the data that they've outlined. So states can lay the foundation for secure but accessible linked data by creating policies that address who has access to the data, what data they access, how they access the data, and as Elizabeth was saying earlier, why they have access to the data. So I think in addition to these processes, there for concerns from parents and others about privacy, that there's a clear purpose and a value from providing access and the use of this data. Next is looking at data quality. So ensuring data quality is critical to building trust in the use of the data. Data will not be effective if users lack confidence in its quality. And to address data quality, states have implemented processes to regularly review the quality of the data. Again, where there's a process for users to access and use the data is helpful because when data is used, it helps improve the quality because users can identify any inconsistencies or errors early in the use of the system. And this is done by building in mechanisms for reporting any data discrepancies or issues as you're building or as you're beginning to use data from your integrated system. Documentation to ensure the accurate collection and use of data, as well as the alignment of data definitions between early childhood and K through 12 system is an important thing to think about and consider as you're developing and looking into integrating your data. A resource in our guide is the Common Education Data Standards, and this was a national effort led by the National Center for Educational Statistics to provide guidance to states on commonly collected data elements. So this includes standard definitions with the goal of making it easier to share state administrative data across early learning and elementary systems and beyond. So you'll find that in our resource guide as well. So an example here is from Minnesota's Early Childhood Longitudinal Data System. And you'll see here, they also have an online portal that has made their data publicly available, which includes a data guide, a data dictionary, and a list of all of the data sources detailing each source's year of data collection. The purpose of these guides is to promote understanding of the integrated data contained within their system by having written documentation about how the data are to be used, accessed, kept secure, and then also to define important terms used within the system. And these all go to improving the quality and the confidence of the data and the transparency so that for those that are accessing the data are using that data, understanding how it was collected, and understanding appropriate uses for that data. Last but not least is state capacity. For all the focus areas that we've reviewed for this webinar, it's important to think through what funding, technology, or staffing you require to adequately manage the data effectively, interpret the data, as well as translating it into actionable information such as research reports, dashboards, or report cards so it can be used by decision makers to take action. Part of building capacity is also building a culture around using data regularly to guide decision making. State and local programs vary in their capacity to use data, and making data available is generally not enough if staff are not equipped with the skills to interpret and use the data to inform practice. An example of the growing Evaluability Together is an example of a program in Minnesota focused on supporting early childhood programs to use data. This program, along with other best practices in Minnesota, are highlighted in a recent report on evaluating program access using Minnesota's Early Childhood Longitudinal Data System, which is also highlighted in our guide. If you're interested in learning more about our organizations and accessing our recent publications, you can go to our website or connect with us through our social media. I want to thank you, and I think we are going to move into questions and discussions for the rest of the webinar.
Thanks, Carly, so much for all of this great information for us to consider. At this time, we're hoping that you all have a lot of questions, and if so, please feel free to type them in the chat box now. I am going to ask a question to kick things off, and it's more of just, since you did give us such a wealth of information, I was just wanting to know, would you be able to share 2 key questions that our legislative audience on the webinar today might consider asking in their home state?
There are so many, I cannot limit myself to so few. But I would point everyone again to the wonderful list of questions that Carlise provided at the outset of this webinar. If you, in your state, cannot answer some of these questions about things like the alignment of early childhood and K-12 programming, how effective are different kinds of early childhood programming in preparing children from different backgrounds to be successful in K-12 and beyond, even just a basic question of how many children are being served in the early childhood programming in your state. That is often a very challenging question, back to the point Carlise made earlier about all these different systems being very siloed, and children moving from program to program or participating in multiple programs at the same time, and being able to accurately assess the children's experiences in early childhood, and then seeing how that does affect them in the early years in K-12.
And I would just add on to that, if you're not already aware of efforts that are happening in your state and you want to understand more about what's happening in terms of improving access to early childhood data in your state, I think we've documented, even though not as many systems are able to do what North Carolina or Pennsylvania or some of the examples that we've given, there's currently a lot of work happening. And so I would encourage participants to ask either their early learning council sort of what advances have already been made and kind of, what are the focus and the goals. Because I think when we've spoken to different policymakers and groups, I think as Elizabeth was saying and I mentioned earlier, because early childhood spans departments of education, departments of human services, as well as departments of health, there may be work happening that you're not aware of that's coming out of one of these different departments. And so I think we provide a lot of information on our site, and I think we're happy to be a resource. But I think just getting a sense where things are in your state, if you don't already know, is kind of an important first step. And this guide, I think, will be helpful in asking questions about different areas that, if they've already been addressed, what type of stakeholder engagement process has happened, and really sort of what do they anticipate the focus and the goal of the system to be, I think is really helpful if you're not already engaged.
Thank you. Just to remind folks, if you do have questions, you can type them into the chat box at any point. And while we wait to see if there are questions, I actually have a question for Elizabeth. While you were presenting, back on slide, I think it was 13, you were talking about parents wanting data, and I'm just kind of curious. You mentioned the parent polling. If you could tell us a little bit more specifically about how you conducted the poll. Were they just Q&As to folks? Were they coming through texts, or how did you get your information?
Sure. We actually contracted with Harris and Nielsen to conduct the poll. So it was done scientifically with a sample of over 1,000 parents. And we actually just conducted another parent poll this past spring that we're working on preparing the results from that to put out this summer or early fall. So it is a representative sample of parents from across the country from different backgrounds. Because we're a data-focused organization, a lot of the questions obviously focus on parents' feelings about data. So it actually covers a lot of different topic areas. The slide that I showed was a very brief snapshot. But we do ask parents about how do they feel about teachers using data in the classroom to support learning. How do parents feel about data being collected? Do they understand what's being collected and how it's being used and how it's being protected and kept safe? That's obviously a concern of the group. So we ask parents about their feelings there, and also their feelings about data sharing and appropriate data sharing with different kinds of agencies that support children's learning. So I encourage all of you to go to the Data Quality Campaign website. There's information there. Maybe I can share that with Allison and Julie, and you can send it around. And keep a lookout for our newest parent poll results.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth. I also wanted to mention, too, that view NCSL as a resource for any of your data questions. We are more than happy to share the North Carolina data privacy law, that legislation with, Connecticut, with anyone who is interested. And I have a question that I would like to ask, and that is just in the broad sense of costs. How much does something like this cost states to set up either a data system or to set up more of a data roadmap or do some of this governance work? And again, in the broad sense.
Lise, I don't have an overall number. I think I'm happy to share some estimates that we've received from Pennsylvania, but I think we've seen states in terms of funding this work in different ways. And so a lot of states utilize their Early Learning Challenge Grant funding to make advancements in their data systems and to do some stakeholder engagement and planning around that. So in our report that we have on that, we provided some estimates about the percentage of their grant and the amount of funds that they used around that development work. What we found is a lot of states are leveraging and including their data in their state longitudinal data systems used by their departments of ed. And so it's a little bit difficult to sort of parse out that one part. But there are states that are building completely separate questions. So I think that's an area that we're still trying to get a handle on. I would say that our report on the Early Learning Challenge states is one place where we've highlighted, at least for 7 states, sort of the proportion of the funds that they used in order to do that. But I think what we've heard from states generally is that it tends to be more expensive in implementing, and then the ongoing cost is less over the years. But I can share the Pennsylvania estimate that we have with you. But I think just because the states are so different, the costs are going to be different because you're also building an existing kind of, if they're replacing existing systems, most states are already spending money on some type of system to aggregate and analyze their data. So it gets a little complicated there.
Thanks, Carlise. I was also wanting just to follow up with another question regarding Kentucky. Elizabeth, do you mind repeating that website that you had mentioned earlier about Kentucky Center and the work that they're doing with their stakeholder engagement and the data is available at county and state level?
Yes. Kentucky is a state that I talk about quite a lot. I really love the work that they do. That center is called the Kentucky Center for Education and Workforce Statistics. So they are essentially the cross-agency data governance body. They examine and kind of bring together data from all the different agencies from early childhood all the way through the workforce. They produce quite a lot of different kinds of reports. So the early childhood profiles is just their early childhood report, but they have a lot of other information. The website is kcews.ky.gov. And this profile, and since I have a little bit of time to talk about it, is so excellent in so many ways because they've been doing this for about 5 years now, and if you go back to some of the earlier years and pull up those reports, there's the county level and there's also a state level report. You can kind of see over the past few years how they have been improving upon the report, and I really think that has to do with their stakeholder engagement. They really start, and they do this with a lot of their reporting, they start out with stakeholder engagement, and they ask people who are going to be using these resources, what kind of data would you like to see here? How would you like it to be displayed? How would you like this page to be laid out so it makes sense to you? Each of the county reports is only 2 pages, so this picture here is kind of page 1 and then there's a page 2, so it's very brief. As you can see, it's very graphical, it's very clear. Everything is explained, and the data that is presented here is the data that people wanted to see. The folks in the local communities who were going to use this report had a lot of input into what information was critical to them in doing their work at the local level, and then the state responded to that. So that's why I always very highly recommend this report. And Kentucky, I believe, is the only state that does this kind of report. So that's why I always talk about all their wonderful work. And if any state folks on this call would like me to connect them with KCEUS, I'd be happy to do that. I do a lot of work with them, and if you'd like to learn about what they did, kind of to the question earlier about how much does this all cost, I would also say that's a very challenging question. But what we recommend is learn from what other states are doing and share with each other the wonderful work that everyone is doing, because that'll kind of save everyone money over the long run if we can all develop a good resource and then share it with each other. And I think Kentucky would be happy to share with anyone who would like to learn more about this wonderful work. So you can just let me know and I can help connect you.
It looks like Allison just provided the link for folks in the chat box if they want to take a closer look. So thanks. I think that before I hand it over to Allison, I just wanted to mention that NCSL is a partner with ECDC, and we also do work with DQC. So if you have any follow-up questions after this call, feel free to contact us, and we'd be more than happy to start a dialogue with ECDC and DQC. So Allison, I'm going to hand it back over to you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Elizabeth and Carlise. I think the presentations were both, well, the presentation in general was terrific and very helpful. As I mentioned at the beginning, an archived copy of this webinar will be available shortly on NCSL's web. I'll send an email around to everyone once it's archived so that you can view it. And on that link, which is on your screen right now, you can also access it once it's available. We are going to invite you all to sign up if you're interested in joining us in July and August for the final 2 webinars of our 5-part series. This July, we'll hear from Steve Barnett from the National Institute for Early Education Research, also known as NEAR. During that webinar, he'll be sharing his findings from the annual State of Preschool 2016 report. And then in August, we'll take a look at young dual language learners. Also, this August in Boston, the 6th through the 9th, NCSL will host our annual meeting, the Legislative Summit. As many of you already know, Boston is a wonderful place for conferences. If you have not already signed up, I would strongly encourage you to do so by following the link you see on your screen. This summer in Boston, you will discover fresh ideas and will learn from policy innovators and industry pioneers. You'll have an opportunity to take home solutions that work and network with hundreds of state legislative colleagues. Register now for the summit where revolutionary ideas are born. Finally, I want to just let you all know that your feedback really is helpful to us in creating the most meaningful and beneficial programming. So an online evaluation survey will pop up on your computer screen at the conclusion of this webinar. And I would really ask that you just take a few moments to complete the survey. We take what you say seriously and honestly, and it helps us in designing our programming. When the archive copy is available, I'll most likely send the link to reply to the survey in that email as well. In closing, I just want to say thank you to all of you for hopping on today and joining us. Remember that NCSL is here for you. If you have any questions, comments, feel free to email any of the staff members of the Early Care and Education Project team. Julie and I are both really eager to hear from you and assist however we might be able. Thanks again for joining us, and we hope to see many of you on the webinar in July. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day.